The proceeding will start.
Order, order. Welcome to the Public Accounts Committee on Monday, the 18th of March 2024. Today we're looking at the appointment of non-executive directors across government. Non-executive directors are appointed to serve on government departments' boards as well as arm's-length bodies, and they provide valuable external expertise, and when it works well, it can go very well. But when we've been looking at how the government goes about making these appointments, we've uncovered, thanks to the support from the National Audit Office, that it doesn't know how many non-executive directors are serving on the boards of arm's-length bodies, and not all appointments are regulated by the Cabinet Office's governance code. Many appointments are also taking longer than they should. In the financial year to 2023, only 7% of appointments were completed within the Cabinet Office's own target of 3 months. And the diversity targets for public appointments haven't been met between 2019 and 2022 when they were last measured, and it hasn't got a target beyond 2022, even though we're already in 2024. So there is good news, and we'll hear a bit more hopefully from our witnesses today, that in last year the Cabinet Office did launch a new applicant tracking system. So some hope there, but we'll find out from our witnesses whether that's working. I'd like to introduce our witnesses. We have in front of us Alex Chisholm, the Permanent Secretary at the Cabinet Office. I'll come back to him in a moment. He's joined by Michael Jary, the Government Lead Non-Executive at the Cabinet Office. Simon Madden, who is the Director for Propriety and Ethics at the Cabinet Office, and Elizabeth Passey, who has the important role of chairing the Rural Payments Agency. So 3 active non-executives, so we're really pleased to have you and hear from the horse's mouth, so to speak. But before I open our session, or Mr Ginogli opens our session for us today, I did want just to give Sir Alex Chisholm a moment, because I want to just reflect, first of all, Sir Alex, that this is your last appearance in front of us as Permanent Secretary at the Cabinet Office. Doesn't he look D-mob happy? We want to thank you for your time appearing in front of us and giving us candid, sometimes candid answers to questions, but also behind the scenes, we know the important work that you do across government by being Permanent Secretary of the Cabinet Office. So thank you for that. But I'm going to indulge you with the indulgence of the committee to see if there's any comments you'd like to make about your role as you're leaving it.
Very kind of you, Chair, indeed. And I should apologise, just I'm a little bit growly today, but if I could purr, I would be purring. So you're right, I have given evidence on a number of occasions. We got up to 50 and then stopped counting, so over the last decade, and it's been a real privilege giving evidence to Parliament, and particularly to the Public Accounts Committee. So I did have just 3 things briefly wanted to share with you. And neither of them, of course, intended to influence the questions you're going to ask us afterwards. First of all, I do think we are rightly very self-critical and demanding in our expectations of our system of government in this country. But as part of this, I think we should recognise when we do things well. And I do think the system of accountability we have for accounting officers, the work of the National Audit Office, the work of this committee, taking evidence in public based on a very thorough pre-agreed written report, information agreed beforehand, and with cameras rolling, is a very good system. And I know from my travels around the rest of the world, and when I compare notes with other people with like positions to me in other countries, they look to this as the gold standard. And I think that when you have the gold standard, you need to be very aware of that and to be rightly proud of it. I also feel the process that we have of following up after these hearings with Treasury minutes and recall sessions as well is all part of that high level of accountability. So first of all, I think it's a very strong system. Second point is that having been giving evidence, I say, for over a decade, I do think it's got better in recent years in a couple of respects, and obviously that reflects well on you, Chair Dame McHillier, and you, Deputy Chair Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown, and other members of the committee, and also I think the CNAG, Gareth Davis, who all of you in your different ways have tried, I think, to make this a system which, well, very rightly challenging and probing, also tries to take account of the circumstances in which people are trying to get their work done, of the human beings involved, who are always imperfect through that, and have used that to try and understand and give a balanced and proportionate account of what has happened, and done that sometimes in a sympathetic way as well as a challenging one. I think that's a very good standard. I also feel that you have tried to focus not just on, if you like, the past for kind of seeing what went wrong, but more importantly for drawing lessons for the future, and in particular having very actionable and useful guidance for us to follow. And there have been lots of examples of that, but I think recent ones particularly that come to mind would be the digital transformation reports that you have done, which again have been hugely valuable to us in government to follow. So, and I think that focus on things that we can use to drive continuous improvement is a really good attention point for the committee. The last thing I wanted just to say was that although I think again rightly the accounting officer responsibility is personal, and so you people of my position are directly personally responsible to Parliament for the conduct of their departments or their public bodies and their use of resources. It is just the tip of the iceberg, and there's an enormous amount of effort that goes into preparing for these sessions, and you see these great packs that we have, and it's not that I wrote all of that myself, so I want to just take the chance also to thank for the 50-odd sessions I've done, all the teams of people, finance teams, policy teams, project teams who've helped prepare for this in the bodies that I have led, the Competition and Markets Authority, Business, Energy, Industrial Strategy Department of the Cabinet Office. They're the hidden heroes of this whole process, so thanks very much to them.
Well, thank you very much, Sir Alex. Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown, Deputy Chair.
Sir Alex, it is a sad occasion that we're saying goodbye to your last appearance in Public Accounts Committee, but hopefully you will appear elsewhere, and we wish you really well in your future. We have always welcomed your appearances before the committee. They've always been clear, concise and cogent. As is proper, we haven't always agreed, the appointment of a government chief risk officer being one of those, but on other issues like the importance of improving digital transformation across government, we have agreed. So we've always welcomed your appearances before this committee. We thank you very much for giving such clear and concise and cogent evidence. We wish you well in your future career, and I hope our paths cross again.
Thank you very much.
And you heard that the Deputy Chair talked about clear, concise and cogent.
Yep.
Took these twice. I think that's a hint for the tone we're trying to achieve today. So thank you very much for that. And we do recognise the important, obviously, the direct accountability of accounting officers to this committee. So I'm glad that that's also appreciated the other way round. Thank you very much. And over to Jonathan Ginocchia MP to kick off on our session today on non-executive
Thank you,
directors.
Chair. Yes, back to today's business, which is non-executive directors, and we'll start off with the roles and responsibilities. And I think by way of introduction, I'm going to start with the NAA report, paragraph 1.5, which says non-executives sit on governing boards of government departments and arm's length bodies. Boards are expected to advise and supervise their organisations. They provide strategic leadership, scrutinise performance, promote transparency, and take a long-term perspective. Boards have executive members who participate in the day-to-day running of the organisation, and non-executive members who do not, and therefore add an independent, objective perspective. So I think the first question to Sir Alex would be, how do you assess non-executives' contribution to the effective running of government?
Thank you very much indeed, and I will begin to answer that, and I think that also very likely Michael Jary will want to comment as well. I think that's a very good summary of the role of non-executive directors. They do provide that independent challenge and support. How can you know whether it's working? Well, I think first of all the chairs of the relevant bodies are very important arbiters of that, and as part of their responsibilities, they will do periodic reviews of the effectiveness of the boards. And we've just done one of those processes ourselves in the Cabinet Office, for example. We got a lead Ned for another department. He attended one of our board meetings, interviewed members of the board, interviewed people who'd appeared in front of the board like that, and formed from that a view about how effectively the board was working by comparison with other boards that he had been a part of. So that is one good measure. I think it's also important in departmental boards to reflect that they are there to try and help both ministers and the official heads of departments. So again, I would look to try and satisfy both of those important stakeholders in the work of the boards. There's also an external test of whether boards are well set up for success that comes sometimes from periodic reviews. The Public Bodies Programme, for example, will look at the effectiveness of governance arrangements. And then we're also, if you like, more data-based approaches saying, are the boards meeting the correct number of times? That's something that is recorded in Michael's annual report on departmental boards. Are they have a suitable composition, both from a diversity perspective, but also for particular skills for the board to be able to draw on? So that probably gives some indications.
It does. And if I could just perhaps extend that to Mr. Jary, and again in general terms, to start with, is this a system that is working as it should?
I think it's a system which, certainly from speaking from my position as lead non-executive and on behalf of the team, if I can put it that way, of departmental non-executives, there's about 75 of us across the departments, we find the role is something which we believe is valuable, and frankly, if we didn't, we wouldn't be here. We've got plenty of other things we could be doing with our time. And we do it because I think we believe in the impact of good governance in all venues, including government itself. And we believe that our role actually, both in its formal role but also in the informal way in which we can provide guidance and advice and mentoring to officials and sometimes to ministers, is a very valuable one. If you're looking for specific hard metrics or evidence for that, there are some roles which non-execs do which are formal. In particular, they participate in the discussion of the outcome development plans in departments. They participate in the stock take meetings that take place between departments, the Treasury and the Cabinet Office. They sit on appointment boards of senior officials, very often arm's length body chairs. And they also take a lead role in conducting the appraisal of the permanent secretary and sometimes other senior officials within the department. So those are very visible roles which the non-execs carry out. But in addition, on the board and often outside the board, we have a role of offering our advice and expertise, counselling ministers and officials, and that is something whose effectiveness is difficult to ascribe specifically to the non-execs, but we certainly believe it makes a difference and contributes to good governance and good decision-making.
Thank you. And Ms. Passey, from your more cold-faced perspective, what contributions do non-executive directors make to the boards of arms length bodies and government companies?
Thank you very much for the opportunity to address that question. The first role that boards take is to ensure that the organisation is well run. So not to try to run the organisation, but to try and make sure it is well run. So that would be my first contribution I'd suggest they make. I think the second role that they carry out is that they provide a sounding board and a secure base, for want of a better word, for the leadership, which ultimately in any role, and indeed in your own roles, is a reasonably lonely place to be. And so they provide that sounding board where the executive can explore ideas around strategy, around operational activities that they might not feel comfortable always sharing with more junior individuals within the organisation. And then the third comment I'd make, if I may, and slightly it answers your previous question as well with regard to effectiveness, a good board, and most boards that I've come across do, evaluate themselves either once a year or indeed after every single board meeting. And I would give the Rural Payments Agency an example of that, as at the end of each board meeting we do evaluate the effectiveness of that board and whether we felt we covered the topics we should have done. So I hope that helps answer the previous question as well.
It does. NAA report paragraph 3, it says departments and their ministers are primarily responsible for appointing their own non-executives. Cabinet Office has oversight of the public appointments process. So perhaps to Mr. Madden, with your current procedures, are you able to ensure that departments and arm's length bodies are following the procedures for appointing a non-executive director set out in the governance code?
Thank you, Chair. Well, as you've rightly said, the Cabinet Office has a role in providing oversight to the whole system, oversight of the whole system. I think it's fair to say we don't micromanage each individual appointment, as you'd expect. It's our role to ensure that there are the right frameworks in place and that that we are a point of escalation if a board or a Secretary of State is unable to resolve a particular issue. So we're there to provide the guidelines and the guardrails, as it were, in terms of the regulation and the regulatory framework, and then as a point of escalation if there are issues that emerge.
Okay, so we know, and the Chair mentioned this in opening remarks, that the government does not know how many NEDs in total are serving on all the government boards, including arm's length bodies and government companies. So that being the case, how can you provide effective oversight if you don't have a full picture of the landscape?
Well, I'd say that we probably do have a complete picture of the landscape. I mean, there's more to do on that, but we don't necessarily recognise non-executive directors as a distinct category. So the vast majority of public appointments themselves are non-executives, but not all of them would be described as non-executive directors. So they may be described as trustees, commissioners, advisors, board members, chief inspectors, adjudicators, etc. So we don't necessarily recognise that category of non-executive directors on boards. What we do have is we understand the picture around total regulated appointments, which is around 4,476, and on unregulated appointments, again, we don't have a central list of what they are. We'd expect departments to have an overview of their appointments landscape themselves.
So where there is non-compliance with the code, how would you record that and how would you follow it up, particularly if you don't know what's going on in all cases?
So any issues of non-compliance with the code would be dealt with in consultation with the Commissioner. We'd be looking for departments to escalate those to either the Cabinet Office or the Commissioner for Public Appointments, whose primary role it is to ensure compliance and oversight, compliance with the Governance Code.
I'm still not sure how you can do that if you don't know who these people are.
Well, we know who hold public appointments.
Not what their appointments are.
We know that they have a public appointment. We know what the public appointment is. What I'm saying is we don't recognise the category of non-executive directors. We will know that X person is an advisor, X person is an adjudicator, but we don't count non-executive directors as a title. We just see it as a title.
And the confidence in your answer is based presumably on the fact that whatever they are, you follow the same procedure.
They follow the same procedure. They follow the governance code, and indeed most unregulated appointments, it's best practice that they also follow the principles of the governance code as well.
Okay. So I'm looking now at NEO report paragraph 1.16. It says ministers have final responsibility for appointing a regulated NED. At the end of the process, ministers should be provided with the list and so forth. I mean, presumably ministers have final responsibility through Alex because ultimately they're going to have to work together on the department's board. Is there another reason?
And ministers are responsible before Parliament for the operation of their bodies.
Okay. So can you just explain how ministers are involved in the appointments process?
Pretty extensively. I mean, first of all, so if a vacancy appears, then you would consult with ministers about the job description, the length of tenure, the remuneration for that post. All of that would go to ministers. If there's going to be a decision to use search firms, again, that would also be something ministers would be consulted on. Then at each stage of the resulting campaign, as we usually call it, ministers would be seen, first asked if they wanted to suggest names to be approached. They would get to see the long list, they would get to see the short list, and then at the end of the process, they would get a write-up of all those candidates who were considered appointable, and they would be able to select from them.
I mean, the fact is that there are different ways that people can be appointed. And so, for instance, what oversight exists for direct ministerial appointments?
The direct ministerial appointments, as the name suggests, don't go through the same process. They are exceptions to the overall rule. There's still subject to kind of public law requirements. The intention is that they should be used for specialist skills and usually short-term appointments. So I think we have, for example, 4 in the Cabinet Office out of 10,000 staff, 4 appointments. One is working on Afghan, 2 on Afghan relocation, 1 on equalities, and 1 on artificial intelligence. So they're short-term appointments made by ministers for a specific purpose, and that's not the same as the overall regulated process. I think the government also is committed to, in response to the Bourbon report that was produced, the Intergovernance, we are committed to publishing a list of all the direct ministerial appointments and to producing a specific piece of guidance about how that should be done correctly.
So I think you're saying that you're not concerned about oversight for these direct ministerial appointments because there's so few of them.
But notwithstanding that, we think that we can do, as Boardman said, an even better job of that, and therefore that specific piece of governance and advisory guidance will be produced later this year on that. Yep.
Okay. So, Ms. Passey, what has your experience been of ministerial involvement for NEDs?
So to answer that question from 3 perspectives, in fact. Firstly, as a candidate. Secondly, as the chairman of the Rural Payments Agency. And then thirdly, as an independent panel member, acting, I think, on 4 government departments' recruitment campaigns. Although I would comment that my comments are made generally because I haven't gone back and thought about whether they are regulated appointments as distinct to general non-executive appointments.
We're dealing with regulators separately, so...
I'm conscious of that, but my analysis, unfortunately, doesn't break that down. Please forgive me. So first of all, as I say, as a candidate, very little knowledge or insight as to whether ministers are or are not involved. You might hear back through the process that it's been slightly slower because of a change of a minister, or indeed that potentially your role might result in an interview with a Secretary of State or a minister. So from the candidate standpoint, that's my main exposure in my experience. From the Rural Payments Agency standpoint, we have, over the period of my term, recruited individuals to the ARAC, the Audit and Risk Committee, and also to the main board. And in that instance, it's managed by the team, the secretariat within my entity, bearing in mind it is an executive agency, so there's clearly going to be much closer control within the department than by the entity itself. They clearly consult on the job spec, what's required on the board. The main board will have some input into that, and it will then go back to the public appointments team within the department. At that point, I'm not wholly clear as to how much intervention the Secretary of State or the Minister may have, but suffice to say, I haven't heard a great deal about their commentary once we have supplied the skills that we feel the board needs in terms of the cycle of that entity. There may well be some input, but I'm not specifically hearing it. With regard to my independent panel member role, I am aware that some appointments and candidates are put forward by ministers and secretaries of state, etc. That doesn't surprise me. Indeed, they're open recruitment processes. You would expect everybody to put candidates forward. What then happens with those candidates subsequently is a slightly different matter, and the involvement of ministers and secretaries of state clearly will vary. And my recollection of the processes through which I have been, which I would also comment haven't been for the last couple of years, were that once we'd received, or rather we had concluded a list that was appointable, it went to the Minister and the Secretary of State, and it was therefore after them as to who was going to be appointed. So those would be my 3 observations on that comment.
And I think in all cases you're basically saying that ministerial involvement, so far as you've seen it, where you're saying sometimes you may not have, has been helpful rather than not helpful.
Broadly speaking, however, I know that there has been some delay in the process as a result of that input. And indeed, in some instances, you're having to go to the Prime Minister as distinct to the Minister and the Secretary of State, and in other instances, to the Crown. And as a result, the impact will probably vary across all of those. But certainly, I wouldn't say for the appointments with which I've been heavily involved, I would suggest the outcome has been anything other than that which I would have expected.
Thank you very much. Someone else is coming on for time with the timing of the applications. But I think, Chair, if I may just finish on the relationship between the non-execs and ministers. I think this is one for Sir Alex, because I actually noticed when I was a junior minister that there were some departments where the Secretaries of State insisted that all ministers had to attend board meetings, and some where, frankly, Secretaries of State were not really bothered at all if ministers went or not, or maybe even dissuaded them from going. The idea being that ministers are siloed, and if they go to the board meeting, they will know what's going on across the department and interact with the non-executive directors. And if they don't go to board meetings, then they tend to stay in their silos, which obviously is not the whole purpose what non-executive directors are about. And more importantly, non-executive directors, if they don't have access to ministers, won't know what's going on either. It's a two-way thing. So this is an observation of mine from a decade ago. Would I be fair in saying that this is still a relevant consideration?
Best practices for Secretaries of State chair boards, and in almost all cases they do, and for a number of ministers to attend those. In the Cabinet Office we have 11 ministers, so we need a very big board for all of them to come, but in fact 4 of them come and contribute strongly to those.
On a rotation
sessions.
basis?
No, it's the same for at the moment. Those whose responsibilities are most cross-cutting effectively. That was also the case when I was at Bays. So I think there's been no... it's outside of my experience to have ministers not coming to meetings. And they certainly seem to value those. And a number of them have also come from experience in corporate life where they're used to having boards and attach great value to that. I think what you will see is that the function played by boards does vary a bit between departments, and some of them are very internally focused on the running of the department and the use of resources, and some are more used in relation to external policy and market facing.
Thank you. Can I ask Mr. Jary to comment on the same issue?
I would say your experience, although it may be a decade old, is still relevant and still valid. So we do know, because we measure it, that 88% of boards held in the last financial year were chaired by the Secretary of State in person. So there will always be occasions when there are diary clashes or Secretary of State is summoned in front of a committee and is therefore absent, but typically they are present. But with regards to other ministers, I think your experience is still valid. There are boards where all of the ministers are invited to attend and typically do, and there are boards where there's a distinction of responsibility with some ministers having a corporate role and others not attending. And it's also the case, of course, that if you take Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, for example, then ministers are travelling a great deal and unlikely to all be available on the same date. So there are practical constraints as well. But generally speaking, I would say boards are attended by a majority of ministers.
They are. So is this an issue that needs to be looked at?
I think, frankly, I think ministers will attend if they find it useful. And that's the biggest incentive and the biggest encouragement. And if they believe it's in their interests because they learn something, they feel that the non-execs and the other board members have contributed to their ability to be effective in their task, then they'll attend. And so the most important thing which we can do is not necessarily impose a rule which always has non-compliance, but is to find a way to make boards even more effective. And that's what I'm trying to do in my role through exchanging best practice across the non-executive network, through making sure that board effectiveness reviews do take place, through making sure that those board effectiveness reviews are reciprocal, so we swap the non-execs as observers on each other's boards and exchange the different practices which exist, and find ways in which we can make boards even more effective. And
I think that's all great and to be commended, but I still don't see that where there is a problem, there's a way of sorting it out.
Well, I suppose the other mechanism which I have at my fingertips is the attendance at boards is reported both in the governance statement of the report and accounts of the department, but also in my annual review. For each department, it's displayed, and as is the frequency of board meetings being held, and you see strong variation across departments. And then I suppose it's for the general public and for committees like yourself to call the ministers to account on performance on that.
So does that mean, Chair, we should be looking at
we do indeed
of departmental performance in this regard? Are there you said you had those figures.
Yes.
I think perhaps we should see them
they're in my annual review, and I'd be happy to supply them to you.
We certainly look at them with individual departments where there's been a concern. I think that's really where our focus tends to be.
Thank you, Chair.
But thank you very much, Mr. Ginogly. I just wanted to ask you, well, Sir Alex, maybe Mr. Madden, decide which one he wants to answer. What criteria you're applying to decide whether an appointment should be regulated or non-regulated? Mr. Madden.
Thank you.
Yeah, the Secretary of State's looking towards you, so there you go.
It's very clear steer. Unregulated appointments largely are those which would perhaps cause an inconsistency or conflict with the governance code in terms of how they would be recruited. So in addition to direct ministerial appointments, which we've already touched on, I would say the vast majority of unregulated appointments would be those where their appointment process may be dictated in something like a royal charter or in other legislation where it's very clear that a distinct process needs to be followed. I think an example of that for you, just to bring it to life a bit, would be the chair of the British Council, where the terms of the Royal Charter there insist that the chair of that board is elected. So it's not something that is capable of being put through the governance code and the normal sort of regulated route. But regulated appointments, whether regulated or unregulated, we strongly encourage all departments to follow the governance code where it doesn't conflict with the set appointments process. We encourage them to follow the governance code as best practice. Okay.
Because in answer to Mr. Ginogly, you did say that you get them to, whether they're regulated or not, to follow the code. So in practice, are there many examples like the British Council where, because it's elected, you can't do a regulated or an unregulated appointment, really, in the sense that in that way? In practice, is it really effectively the same thing?
I think in practice it's the same thing, that they follow the code, and there are always those sort of edge cases, but that is usually why there would be a conscious decision. But certainly if it was a new role and there was new legislation in respect of a particular role that had been established, if that conflicted with the governance code, then obviously that wouldn't be regulated. And
what data do you collect on these appointments? You touched on a bit in some of the other questions, but I mean, are you looking at the unregulated appointments and seeing if they're following through on the regulated appointments approach?
So
following the code? On
unregulated appointments, there isn't a central list of how many there actually are, you would imagine, though, using the applicant's tracking system, that as that system matures, that departments would then start to put their unregulated appointments through that system. And in fact, that's already started in practice. So of the 360 campaigns, for example, that went through the applicant tracking system, the new service, since April, 127 of those were unregulated. So I'm confident that over time we'll start to build up centrally a picture of unregulated appointments as departments use that service to also recruit unregulated appointments.
But in terms of there's potentially other data, like so the number and frequency and maybe things like turnover, if you've got some appointments where people are turning over faster, there's no way at the moment you have a central oversight of any of that.
No, we don't have central oversight of anything on unregulated appointments.
So even things like how often ministers put forward names on regulated appointments, you don't know.
On regulated appointments,
you would know that.
We would know that, but not unregulated.
But they wouldn't tend to be so involved in the unregulated.
Yes.
What about when ministers have overridden advice for regulated appointments? Would you have that?
So if they're following the code of governance, there's yet to be an occasion where ministers have appointed or sought to appoint someone who's been deemed non-appointable. So even if an unregulated, if it's the case where there is an unregulated appointment and the department is following the code of governance, they would have the sort of usual architecture that you'd expect in a regulated appointment, such as the advisory assessment panel. And although the same role of the commissioner, for instance, in terms of regulating, wouldn't apply, I think it highly unlikely that ministers would choose to appoint over the advice of the advisory assessment.
Okay, because I mean, the Commission for Public Appointments has been vocal on some issues where names have been in the frame, even before appointment process has gone through. As Director of Propriety and Ethics, do you have a role in that, and do you have to call out ever departments or indeed ministers for putting names out into the public domain and flying a kite, or indeed trying to promote a favourite potentially? Or how do you handle that as Director of Propriety and Ethics?
Well, we would look to have any of those issues referred to us by the Permanent Secretary, who obviously, as the accounting officer, is responsible for propriety in their own department, and we would be on hand to receive any to offer any advice where it asked for.
So it's proactive from the department,
the department,
not the other way.
No, that's where the responsibility sits primarily, as with the accounting officer.
So Alex, is that not a potential challenge? If you're an accounting officer and you've got lots, you might be pushing for ministerial direction on something, which I know, although we think is not a bad thing, it can be quite challenging for accounting officers in some circumstances. And you've got a minister who maybe was trying to push something. Is it not perhaps weighted the wrong way that Mr Madden doesn't have the power, or indeed you as Cabinet Office Permanent Secretary doesn't have the power to go in and push on ethics?
Well, it's ministers who have the responsibility, and in my experience they're pretty careful how they exercise it, because they're very conscious that the whole business of appointments attracts a lot of public attention, rightly so. They don't want to be criticised for having breached rules, even informal rules. And as ministers who themselves chose, for example, to say the appointment of non-executive board members, which used to be unregulated, last summer that was brought into regulation, they've chosen to do that. Even before it was regulated, I found that ministers were very, very cautious about the correctness of the whole process, like that, understanding it would be subject to public scrutiny.
It's perhaps worth adding, Chair, as well, that in response to the Boardman report and the associated reports last July, the government strengthened the rules around transparency should a minister decide to appoint an unappointable. So that now has to be declared publicly with reasons stated.
And you said earlier, I think none had been, but can you just, maybe I misheard?
Yes, that's right, none have been.
Since?
Ever.
So no names have gone to them, they've not overridden a list?
No minister to date has appointed someone that an advisory assessment panel has deemed non-appointable.
Okay, because interesting, because often there's speculation in the media, but you're being very categoric about that. Okay, and then do you, again, with this lack of data, do you know department versus department what's happening in terms of, as I say, turnover of appointments, how long it takes? Do you have any way of benchmarking from department to department?
Well, the applicant tracking system now will allow us to do that much more effectively, and we now have a situation where all regulated appointments are using the new digital service. So over time, we're going to build up that a much richer picture of how each department is performing, not only on timeliness, but also on things like candidate care and the overall causes of delay. So the strength of the ATS is that it's going to massively improve our data picture.
Okay, and do you follow a minister from department to department? So you could theoretically, and I'm not suggesting anything, but if a minister was always slow or always named somebody that they knew in a role, would you know that, or would that be so departmental specific?
We don't track it explicitly, but if there was a concern from either an old department or a new department, then I'm sure they'd make that known and share it with their colleagues.
Okay, and when you pick up a common issue, especially with the new applicant tracker system, about where a delay is built in, what's the levers you've then got to try and kick the system to speed it up or make a better approach in a different direction? I'll perhaps come to Mr. Jary on that as well, Mr. Madden.
Well, of course, we're still to some degree in the foothills of the applicant tracking system, although it's been in place since April and we've now got all regulated appointments going through. Not all departments are using it as effectively as we would like. So, but we have introduced, under the leadership of Baroness Neville-Rolfe, the the Minister who is really driving this in the Cabinet Office on behalf of the Deputy Prime Minister. She has introduced a new mechanism called a ministerial departmental deep dive, so where she calls in individual ministers with their team, and we go through all of the issues relating to the department. So we check the extent to which they have a robust forward plan in terms of their appointments. We look at the timeliness of appointments, and we look at the broader capability that the department is exhibiting, and obviously use that as an opportunity to offer any support if needed.
Okay, and is that proving effective?
So I think that so we've had a few of those now, and I think that the benefit is that it also means that it creates an incentive for departments to use the ATS properly, because it's the ATS data that is being used to judge their
They don't have to use the ATS at the moment.
So it's mandated.
So yes, it is now mandated.
It is now mandated.
Okay.
It is required.
But that's all let's just be clear, for the regulated appointments only.
For the regulated appointments.
Okay.
But as I say, over time, we'd envisage that departments would start using it for unregulated.
And how would you define significant appointments, and which ones would need to go to a select committee of this House, for example, for pre-appointment scrutiny?
Significant appointments. There are just some appointments that are so important that a minister would judge that they require a heightened degree of assurance, and that assurance is provided by a senior independent panel member, being on the advisory assessment panel, and as you no doubt know, a SIPM, senior independent panel member, cannot be politically active. They need to be independent of the department and independent of the body concerned. Those appointments that are deemed significant are on a significant appointments list that has to be agreed with the Commissioner. Some examples of significant appointments are, for instance, the Crown Estates Commissioners, members of the Financial Conduct Authority, HM Chief Inspector of Prisons, Ofwat, the DG Independent Office, the DG for the Independent Office of Police Conduct. So those that may have a particular regulatory role.
Mr. Jary, do you want to add anything?
In my world, so I'm talking about the non-executives on departmental boards, obviously, which are only about 3% or so of the total number of public appointments. But it is something which I've spent a lot of time on in my role, is seeking to make sure that appointments do flow through the process and that we avoid vacancies arising, or we fill them as early as possible. The presence now of the applicant tracking system will make life a lot easier, because I've been doing that manually. That's possible for the 90 or so roles that I have in the non-executive departmental boards. But the applicant tracking system will make things a lot easier. Where things are delayed, very often they're stuck at some point in a lengthy process. And one of the challenges that I've experienced many times is actually not knowing where they're stuck. Whose in tray is it in? Is it in the Cabinet Office, in number 10, in the department? If it's in the department, is it with a SPAD? And trying to get it unstuck. The applicant tracking system will make that easier, because we'll be able to identify what stage of the process it's reached. And then I think you have this constant tension that ministerial involvement is utterly to be welcomed, because for non-executives to be effective, they have to have the confidence of the minister, and the minister has to be interested in them. So it's a critical part of the process, as they are ultimately the appointee. But the ministers also can be a source of delay. They can take a long time to getting round to decision making. And the biggest contributor to delay is, of course, if the process is interrupted by a change of Secretary of State, which in the last year or so, or last year, happened a great deal. And one of the reasons which I think has contributed to the very long number of days you see in the NAO report is that their data was drawn from a period when a large number of departments change their Secretary of State, and that undoubtedly delays the process.
Which leaves an organisation with a non-exec or indeed in some cases without a chair, so very significant. In terms of transparency, we've touched around this a bit, but when I've looked at public appointments being made through, Mr Madden talks about the independent person being non-political. Actually, in some cases, they are much more political than they might appear at surface level. If you do a quick search, and I've done this over a few years now, sort of checking down to see who people are. So how do you make sure, Mr Madden, that you are really, or indeed, I suppose Ms Passey, you might be involved, both of you and Mr Jary might be involved with this as well, that you're really making sure that the independent person is independent, and who is proposing who the independent person is?
I think
Mr Madden will start.
I think there's usually a list of candidate SIPMs, but ministers ultimately make that decision.
So for the independent person on the panel, is that a list for the?
Oh, do you mean in the case of significant appointments?
Yes. Sorry,
yes. So the senior independent panel member, there would be a list of senior independent panel members, and ministers would agree that that appointment for that particular advisory assessment panel.
Okay, so it really does go. Okay, that's quite interesting. Well, that might explain why we're seeing this. And Ms Passey on that point.
Well, interestingly, I wasn't aware that the minister or any minister had any input as to whether I should be an independent panel member or not. So I can't comment on their involvement there. But I would also say I am not aware of the distinction between a senior independent panel member and an independent panel member. As far as I'm aware, I've only been an independent panel member. So there may be a distinction of which I'm not aware.
Okay. Well, I'm
not qualified to comment.
Thank you. Mr Peter Grant.
Thanks, Chair. Mr Madden, we heard earlier from the Permanent Secretary that the Minister has sight of the job description and presumably can suggest changes to it. The Minister can suggest individuals who would be worth contacting. Very often the Minister has the final decision. Does anybody keep track of how many of the final decisions go to the person that the Minister originally suggested should be approached?
Sorry, I missed the last part of your question.
Does anyone keep a record of how often the final appointment is made to someone that is on the list because the Minister suggested them in the first place?
I mean, I would say that there would be a record of the interactions, but I don't think that we track against individual ministers, no.
So it would be quite possible for a minister to be actively and quite firmly making sure that their preferred candidate was appointed more often than not, or possibly even all the time, and the system wouldn't necessarily identify that. Is that what you're saying?
Well, the basis of our system is that ministers make these appointments. Officials present the advice that has come from the advisory assessment panel, which will have a list of people that they have deemed appointable, and ministers appoint from that list.
So
I could add another
everything we're looking at just now, and everything that's described in the annual report about the process that's gone through, is it possible or impossible for a minister simply to ignore all of that, as long as they make sure that their person is not thrown out for being completely unappointable? And if you're allowed to change a job description, then you can make sure that your preferred candidate is appointable. Is there anything to stop a minister from completely ignoring all the governance that's gone on before, gets the list and said, well, I decided 3 weeks ago that that's who was going to get the job, so they're going to get it?
I think, first of all, it would need to match up against the job description. Also, because the watchword, as the Commission for Public Appointments says, of the whole system is merit, you need to make sure that the candidate was genuinely meritorious. I've certainly had experience of ministers suggesting names, them being put through the whole process, and at the end of it being found not to be appointable, and the minister asking questions about that, but usually accepting that, in fact always accepting that because it can't be changed at the end. So I don't think, if your concern is that by putting someone in at the beginning of the system, they're not really interested in what happens throughout, and at the end they just want to pull the same person out, that's not been my experience at all. Ministers obviously are, very active in public life, have lots of points of connections, and may well be able to suggest well-qualified candidates, but when the process has found they're not the most meritorious or they're not appointable, they've had to accept that. And as Mr. Madden mentioned, there is that safeguard that if you tried to appoint somebody who wasn't appointable, you'd have to do that in a public way. And with the that would appear in the Commission of Public Appointments annual report.
Just to add as well, it's also been my experience. I've sat on a number of advisory assessment panels where, as the departmental representative, where I know what the Minister's views are, and it's part of the role of the departmental representative to reflect those in an advisory assessment panel meeting. But the panel has not deemed that individual appointable. And I may have had a conversation with ministers afterwards to explain that, but there's never been an attempt to overturn or suggest that the panel looks again, or ministers, in my experience, accept the judgment of the advisory assessment panel.
Thank you. Briefly. Mr. McCart, finished? Okay. Thank you. Is this Mrs. Owen?
Just following on from that, I think, Sir Alex, you're probably best placed to answer this. What determines a level of independence, a suitable level of independence for a non-executive director from the ministers that they're working with?
I don't know if that's set down in absolutely explicit form anywhere, so it is a bit of a judgment. There's a requirement for independence. It isn't the case that they should be immune from politics, and indeed a number of candidates do declare their political allegiance. I think the overall number is relatively small. I think about 3% of the total number of regulated public appointments have declared a political allegiance, more or less evenly balanced.
So 3% of all regulated appointments, not of non-exec directors.
Yes.
Yeah,
correct, yeah.
Could they be donors, for example, to a political party, or is that a level of independence too far?
Or level of engagement?
Level of engagement too much. Is that checked at all?
I think that you would expect people to declare donations made to a party as part of the application process.
Yes, that's right.
It is checked above the 5,000 limit. Yes.
And do you know how many NEDs are currently donors to the governing party?
You mean
on the boards of
boards of
departments?
Boards of departments.
Mr. Jary?
No, we don't track that information specifically, but we would obviously examine conflicts of interest. So for non-executive board members, I mean, Michael can speak to this. There's a distinct process for how that is done. For other public appointments, the conflicts of interest process is quite extensive. They have to declare that through the application process, and then any declared conflicts are actually have to be examined in the interview as well. And the panel has to satisfy themselves that those interests won't conflict with their ability to perform the role.
Okay, so in terms of that, that's still just a bit of a judgment call. There is nothing standardised. So one person may have a more rigorous examination than another. There's no standardisation on this. This is just up to the panel.
Well, we would expect self-declaration. I mean, a public appointee also is bound to follow the code of conduct for board members of public bodies. So there is a strong expectation, if you are putting yourself forward, that you are going to abide by the Nolan principles and by the code of conduct and declare what the application process has demanded of you.
Have you made any changes, say, in the last 3 years, 4 years, where this has clearly failed with the Nolan principles and personal interests between relationships between ministers and non-executive directors? Have you made any changes, and have you reviewed whether those changes are sufficient?
To my knowledge, we haven't made any changes specifically in relation to that particular issue. No.
And no changes since Matt Hancock and Gina Colandalaccio's
well, the big change, of course, is that they're now regulated.
I haven't finished. Sorry.
That's
okay. I wondered what rigorous process Boris Johnson's former office chief has had to their recent appointment for an NED on the Department of Health. I just wondered whether there has been any tightening up where we have clearly seen this expectation fail and fall short.
I understand. Thank you. So the big change has been the regulation. So up until last year, non-executive board members of the like that you're describing were not regulated by the Commissioner for Public Appointments. They were completely unregulated in the sense that ministers were making direct appointments. Now they are regulated, so they have to follow the process that I've set out.
Can you just be clear before we move on to Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown that how long it's remind me, because it's a long while since I did my appointment. There is a period of time of since your last political activity that you have to declare it. So I think, is it 2 years or 5? I can't remember.
I think it's 2 years.
2 years. So someone could have been politically active 3 years ago, and they would not absolutely need to declare it, but it would be good practice to do so.
Yes. We would always encourage over-declaring.
Just 2 additional points if I could. One is that even with people who have got a political background, they might have other experiences as well which come into play. The person you mentioned on the Department for Health and Social Care Board, I think, might be an experienced health practitioner among other parts of their previous experience. And just looking at the balance between the parties, I don't know if you had a chance to look at the Commissioner's 22-23 report on the balance between, of those 3% declared political activity, that's 29 out of 1,200, 42.5% of declarations relate to the Conservative Party, 42.5% to Labour, 12.5% for Liberal Democrats, and 2.5% for Plaid Cymru. That obviously relates to England and Wales.
Okay, thank you.
As long as they're being upfront.
So, Mr. Madden.
I mean, just to add, if there are any concerns identified through a process in a department, then those can be escalated to the Cabinet Office if a department is having difficulty creating the right level of mitigations, or they think it's so serious that it might need another look.
Thank you very much. Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown, Deputy.
Alex, can I just ask you a question? Some of the most difficult issues that this committee has to deal with, and I think your department is a par exemplar of this, are cross-cutting government issues. If you are appointed as a non-executive director to one board or one department, do you ever go to a meeting of another board's board?
Yes, in exceptional cases. So in the example I gave before, where you're doing a review of another board's activity as an observer or a formal reviewer, but informally, something which I must say Michael has very much encouraged. There is now a very powerful network where, for example, all the chairs of the ARAC committees, the audit risk committees, they all meet together. The lead NEDs meet together. There are sessions where all of the NEDs come together, a number of times through the year. We have a standardised induction, which in fact was a recommendation from a previous PAC report when you reviewed public bodies. So all of that, I think, is trying to identify opportunities for learning from each other, for sharing common practice. And there is, and then there are informal networks as well, which I think can be very instructive. But
if I may, yes.
Please.
So this is a topic which the non-executives on the boards are themselves very alive to, absolutely, that a lot of the struggles which government tends to have with delivering major programmes and projects is at the cross-cutting interface. As Sir Alex says, we have set up, I think, every 6 weeks, so roughly 10 times a year, a conference of the lead non-executives, 4 or 5 times a year a conference of all of the non-executives, and a lot of what we talk about is these cross-cutting major programmes, and my job is partly also to make sure that the government's overall agenda, not at a departmental level but at a cross-government level, is something which is which all the non-executives are aware of. And then we have ourselves decided to form these groups. So we have groups on the Union of the United Kingdom, on levelling up, on digital, on climate and net zero, and the ARAC chairs have a group as well. And non-execs from across all of the departments meet quite actively in those groups to talk about those issues and exchange best practice.
I'm delighted to hear you mention in that list digital is something that we are very keen in this committee on government improving. So and it was good to hear the work of that cross-cutting work you're doing. So thank you for that. May I come to perhaps Sir Alex, but others may wish to comment on this, and delays of appointments of non-execs. You would be surprised if this committee didn't get to that subject eventually. Paragraph 2.4, using your own data, Sir Alex, we found that on average it took 203 days from competition closing to an appointment being announced on the previous websites. The code, as you all know, sets out the aim should always be to conclude the process within 3 months of a competition closing. But only 7% of appointments were completed within 3 months. 9 took more than a year to complete, with the longest taking more than 400 days. We found that 2022-23 was not unusual, and a similar pattern can be seen in the past 2 years. Now, I'm going to come on to some more detailed questions relating to all of that, but do you just want to sort of comment first before I do that, Sir Alex?
Yeah, thank you very much. So first of all, we agree that it's not satisfactory that it takes so long. And indeed, it's the number one priority for Baroness Neville-Rolfe, who's leading this effort for government to speed up the process. We have already begun to speed the process up. So on the latest data, that figure you quote there for the NAO report, which was 203 days in the previous financial year, we're now at 146 days. So obviously a substantial improvement. We need to continue to improve at the same rate to get closer to 100 or even 90 days, but that's a start. Just to highlight a couple of things which have made a big difference there. I think first of all, I know we're setting a lot of store by this applicant tracking system, but I think that is very important because it does enable you to see where the delays are occurring and to intervene as necessary. We're also very conscious that the time is measured from the campaign closure to the offer being accepted and announced, and sometimes it's the last stage of that process, particularly security vetting and reference checking, other things that could take a while. So making sure that's very much on the clock and there's a sense of urgency there is important. Michael has referred to something which is outside of our control, which is ministerial churn, not a very nice phrase, but appointments being made. And that can obviously affect the overall lapse time. But again, as Mr. Madden referred to earlier, the department by department, we are doing this ministerial deep dives to try and see what we can do to further improve, because everybody shares this commitment. There's nobody there in the system who's saying, gosh, it's acceptable that it takes so long, and we are very conscious that it's wearing for the candidates, and also means that sometimes you only have temporary people in post, or you have to make short-term extensions. So that's not what we want, and bringing it down towards the 90 days is absolutely the intention.
Thank you for that answer. Mr. Jary, how does this whole process compare with the private sector in terms of length of time it takes to appoint a non-exec?
I would say it is longer than the private sector, although the private sector itself also has a big variation of total elapsed time. I think the difference is that this process is regulated, and it therefore goes through a set of steps in a very ordered manner, and that probably does extend the overall time, elapsed time as a consequence. But it also means that it's very visible, whereas in the private sector you would often find that a lot of those steps are not visible because headhunters are out in the market talking to candidates, lining things up, and the process at that stage is not formally started. So it's difficult to make an exact comparison, but I would say it is longer, yes, on average.
Ms. Passey, I mean, you had a lot of private sector experience. What is your experience in terms of how long it takes in the private sector compared to the public sector?
So your shortest appointment I've heard of in the private sector was 6 weeks. Others have been 18 months. So I would suggest that it's not the entire length of the process that differs, it's the amount of latency in the process. I'll give you an example. The University of Glasgow, for example, of which I am the chairman, started its appointment process when I was appointed in 2016, started it in 2015, and it took probably 3 or 4 months to decide that I would be appointed. I shadowed for a year and then I was in the seat. So there's lots of actually chairing or convening the governing body. So there are a lot of different processes going on. I'd say the overall length could be quite similar. However, what's being done during that period of time is very different to the point that Mr. Jary makes. There is a lot of candidate care. There is a lot of coaching people for the role, researching for the role, for the appointment, etc. The other observation I'd make as well is that typically boards in the corporate space, the FTSE 100, the 250, and indeed hopefully in most of our charitable boards and our university boards, will have an expert committee dedicated to appointments, a nominations committee, a remuneration committee, for example. We tend not to have that in the public space on public boards, and therefore you are relying on a central resource or a departmental resource to provide that for you. And so there are some differences that come out as a result of that as well.
Thank you very much. Sir Alex, will your new tracking system be able to tell you and us and everybody else how long the delays are being caused by ministers, indeed the Prime Minister, when it comes to where he has oversight? And do you have any initial comments as to whether in the system at the moment that is one of the key causes of delay?
On the second of those, we certainly have good evidence, and indeed Michael's done the analysis himself, showing that in departments where ministers changed, that added considerably to the total length of the process. So we know that is a big factor. I don't think the new system will identify an individual person on whose desk it is on, but it will show where you are in the process.
Yes, it will help us to identify where it is at each stage, and that tracks in real time. So I would say that we're with 360 campaigns through now. We're getting some idea, but we still haven't got enough to do full analysis to give advice to ministers on what information should be published and how it should be published. But I'm confident that over the next few months we should be in a position to be able to do that. I mean, if I may, Chair, it's worth just pointing out that ministers have set us really clear priorities to focus on improving the system overall. As Sir Alex said, improved timeliness is the first of those. We also need to build departmental capability where it's lacking. Increase diversity of thought and regional diversity, which is the focus in addition to our existing responsibilities on diversity. Those two now are very much at the fore. We've been tasked with improving our outreach so that helps us build a talent pool, and also, crucially, to improve the candidate experience overall. So those are the sort of horizontal pillars, if you were, with improving data through the applicant tracking system as the enabler of all of those.
Really helpful answer, Mr. Madden. Can I just ask you, I hope I'm pronouncing your surname. Is it Jary or Jary?
Jary.
Jary.
Yes, like Mary.
I wouldn't want to get it wrong.
Thank you.
By the time you produce your next annual report, which presumably is based on the financial year, so it'll be around about this time next year, yes. These really important aspects that Mr. Madden has been referring to, would you expect that the tracking system will be working well enough that you will be able to make substantial progress in reporting on all those aspects?
Well, funnily enough, no, I wouldn't. And the reason for that is that what we've been doing in this current financial year is actually dealing with the backlog of a lot of complaints, a lot of appointments, which have been taking a long time, and we've been closing those appointments. And therefore, by the metric which NAO has used, which is the number of days taken at the point when the announcement is made, then we wouldn't expect to see improvement in this year. We will expect to see improvement in the next year. I'm absolutely sure of that.
I wasn't really. It was almost a subset of Mr. Madden's answers to my question. It was all the other aspects, which I'm not going to tread on colleagues because they're going to come in on regional diversity and ethnic minorities and gender minorities and so on. But in all of those really important aspects, with your tracking system, do you expect to have a better handle on the data and the time it's taking by the time you make your next annual report?
Oh yes, absolutely. Absolutely. We'll have much more reliable data and complete data on time. Absolutely, yes.
Mr. Madden wants to
Thank you. And just to add that obviously a key recommendation of the NAO was for us to set out what good looks like, and I think as part of that review of how we can not only just improve the guidance to departments, but perhaps the information on the website, it would seem sensible to set out. So in addition to having the 90-day target in the code, it would seem sensible, I think, to set out a time frame expected for each stage of the process. So that would improve transparency and also help with accountability as well.
Speaking with you, if I may, Mr. Madden, in terms of the delays, what are the impact of the delays having on the quality of candidates, and what is the dropout for candidates who apply for public appointment, and what are you doing to lower that?
Well, we know currently that the attrition rate, as far as we can tell from the data, is around 3%, so a relatively low figure. But we do know anecdotally, we were talking only a few weeks ago to executive search firms to help get this sense of what good looks like from their perspective. And they were telling us that undoubtedly when somebody is applying for a public appointment as part of having a portfolio career, that if a private sector opportunity comes along, they will always choose the private sector opportunity if they're even in the process for a public appointment, simply because they envisage it's going to take longer. So there's that aspect that we have to deal with. I think that there's also, as a result of our outreach work, we've also heard people feeling put off applying in the first place. So not necessarily the attrition rate once somebody has applied, but actually people feeling put off simply because they envisage, they look at the data and think, well, this is going to take forever, so I don't want to really embark on that journey. So we have a great deal of persuasion to put out there to be able to encourage people to apply. If we're judging it solely on timeliness, then obviously that's an incentive to improve overall performance.
So I'm just wondering, hidden in that answer, whether these delays are acting as a disincentive for the very best quality people to apply for non-executives, whether they are going to the private sector.
So I think across all of our appointments, we have extremely talented people. You can see that every day. And some of, well, not some of whom, all of whom are on display today. But yeah, we're not complacent in that there is obviously a degree of some people feeling put off. At least that's anecdotally the feedback that we have. But that only goes to demonstrate the importance of reducing the delays and the time that it takes so that is an incentive for us to double down and bear down on the timeliness issues.
And Mr. Jary, what are the risks to each board if there are vacancies carried on that board caused by these delays?
So boards which are below strength are at risk of not being able to fully carry out their function, particularly with regards to governance. And I would also say that on the boards there are certain key roles. Obviously the lead non-executive is one, but the chair of the Audit and Risk Committee is another very important one, and with very specific skills. And if that role is vacant, then you clearly have a gap in governance of the department. So filling these promptly is important. Starting promptly is also important, because the biggest safeguard against a potentially unpredictable lead time is to have the candidate lined up well in advance.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, all of you.
So, Rowan MP.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Jary, you gave evidence to PAC last year in January, and you gave your commitment to diversity and improving diversity. I think you said that this is certainly an objective of mine.
Yes.
Looking at the figures, we've seen that the number of ethnic minority applicants and appointees has gone down from 2021-22 to 22-23. Have you reviewed why that is? And also, is there a correlation with the fact that there was a drop-off on your diversity plan for 2022? It only ran up to then. And have you got any plans for the future to increase diversity?
So I think I'd just like to understand the source a little bit better, if I may.
It's in this report here.
Because that may refer to a broader population than the population for which I hold responsibility and the population for which I gave evidence to PACAC. So my responsibility relates to the non-executive directors on departmental boards, but that number, I think, is
figure 8.
Is all public appointments in figure 8. So I'm happy to address the question generally, but that's not my population, if I can be parochial about it.
Not your department.
But I do think that I stand by the commitment, which is ensuring that we do improve diversity in in my world, of the appointments that were made in the year 22-23. We had exactly a 50-50 split of gender, men, women, and that will therefore have raised the average and brought it closer to the long-run target, and the only long-run target which makes any sense there is 50%. And we're also committed to diversity along all sorts of other dimensions, particularly, and the government has also made it clear on this point, regional diversity and diversity of thought and social background. And that's important to us as well.
How's that going? And how are you measuring the diversity in background, particularly, I would say, class and ethnicity? Because I think we've just got figures for ethnic minority backgrounds, but obviously there's diversity within diversity there, and it would be really good to find out what data you are collecting in terms of disability as well.
Yes, so appointees declare that on their application, of course, and they then are asked to reconfirm that data once they are appointed. So we have that data. Unfortunately, we don't have it for everyone because that system wasn't in place for the entire population of current departmental non-executives.
Why not?
But because I don't think it was practice at the time to require, or to at least to request, that all appointees completed that data set, whereas now it is.
It's because it's regulated now.
Yes. Well, I think I think that became in before regulation, but not necessarily at the time. We have non-executives at the moment who are in tenure for between 6 and 9 years, for example, and at that point, I think they didn't necessarily complete that data.
One area that is definitely yours is the Cabinet Office, and the Cabinet Office have not set any aspirations beyond 2022. Are you going to tell us that you've got some aspirations in targets to meet in terms of diversity?
Is that Sir Alex? Or
I think that's probably Sir Alex.
That's probably better directed to myself. That's okay. So first of all, just to give the overall picture, which I want to make sure that you can see that when we set out on this, the aim was to try and make sure that appointments made in the year to ethnic minority candidates were in excess of 14%, and that was achieved in the last 2 years. It was achieved by a larger margin, you're right, in 21-22 than 22-23. But I think and as a proportion of the economically active population, I think it's about 15%, so we're 14.55, so very, very close to that. And in relation to appointments made in the year to women, 53%. And I think the overall proportion, which was the goal there, we've reached 48%, which is the same proportion as economically active. So definite progress. So I think the system of the practice of setting targets, which was done back in 2019, we have been able to hit those targets, which is great. No new targets have yet been set, and I don't think I'm not aware of any plan to do so, but obviously the committee may wish to encourage ministers to do so.
Okay, thank you. So I want to look at some of the processes because we've touched on some of them already, and Mr Madden talked about outreach, so I'll come to Mr Madden about that shortly. Looking at figure 3 and the process of appointing a non-executive director, the advisory assessment panels being created, who is in charge of overseeing who the advisory assessment panel is made up of, and are you committed to making sure that it is diverse and reflecting that experience and background that you wanted to see in the applicants that you're asking for?
Is that Mr Madden? Mr. Madden.
So ministers are responsible for agreeing the composition of advisory assessment panels. It's one of their responsibilities under the code. And officials obviously give advice as part of the running of the campaign, but ministers agree who should be on that assessment panel, particularly the departmental representative, and usually, for instance, you'd expect the chair of a body to be on that panel, and a departmental representative or another representative to be able to feed in the views of ministers. But ultimately, it's a responsibility of ministers.
And in terms of outreach, looking more insular at the advisory panels themselves and the ministers, is anything being done to challenge their conscious or unconscious bias, particularly in the long listing processes and the writing up of the jobs and the adverts?
So if I can touch on the role criteria, because they are that is an absolutely essential part of the process. It's not necessarily reflected as so in the figure in the NEO report, but that's really the start of the process, because that there are some departments, and this is where we're looking at building departmental capability. Some tend to, or in the past, have tended to have a sort of boilerplate approach to this, whereas we're encouraging departments to really use that role description to fully reflect the needs of the organisation at the time, so including board composition. So if they need particular representation to enable the board to have a diverse view, we'd encourage that to be reflected in the role description, in the role criteria. But fundamentally, it's that criteria that is so important, because it's that criteria that the advisory assessment panel uses to judge whether someone is appointable, and only that criteria.
Can you see, looking at figure 3, how the panel produces a list of appointable candidates, then the minister selects from that list of appointable candidates, but the people that have whittled down these candidates were actually appointed by the minister themselves? Can you see how that's just an insular, circular process?
I can see how it could look like that, yes.
Do you think it could be improved at all?
I'm sure that's something that could be looked at, but in the current framework of ministers being involved at each stage, as the code requires, there's always room, I'm sure, to improve. But under our current system, it is for ministers to decide the composition of that panel.
And in terms of the outreach, I know that you've done road shows, and I was just going to question, where exactly are these adverts going? I know they're just on the government department, but there are a number of people who are incredibly talented, for which that would be a barrier in itself. Are there any plans to advertise wider than just the government website?
We are looking at that, although we're encouraging people to sign up actually on that government website. So currently, I think there's around 12,000 active accounts, which has increased dramatically over the period we've been doing that outreach. So we've got about 12,000 active accounts. Just over 11,000 of those have actually expressed interest in a public appointment, and then around 5,000 have proactively uploaded their CVs, and they also record their information, so that we know to some degree the diversity makeup of those people who are registering for an account. But that's why we're doing the outreach as well, so that we can target not just individual areas, but also individual sectors. So we want to do some work, for instance, with disabled people's forums, so that we can be targeting candidates from the disabled community. We're also looking to target veterans as a source of potential candidates, and also faith communities as well. So we're trying to not just look at the regional aspect of the outreach, but also some sort of sectoral, community-based criteria as well.
And do you think that increasing the amount of data and the quality of data that you get about applicants and interested applicants as well onto the website might improve this targeting outreach?
Definitely, I think it will. I mean, I think that the overall, we will have a much richer data picture as the ATS matures.
How Alex, I think wanted to come. Did you want to comment? Sorry.
That's okay. Yeah, just to add a couple of things that I think are quite exciting there. One is that as the data picture builds, we'll understand, if you like, the total group of people that we have, and be able to analyse and see some gaps in different parts of the population or different skill sets that we're having. Also, that there is, in the past, I think, a sort of inherent wastefulness that people go through a process and they do very well, but not quite well enough. Maybe they're not a perfect fit for it, or someone even more outstanding came forward. In the past, that person was, thank you very much, whereas now we keep their records, and we recontact them and they say, I'm interested in these types of jobs. So that is, recycling people is a lot more efficient. And just to emphasise the point that, you were rightly saying that sometimes the way we describe jobs is a little bit off-putting. So we have begun to test some of those things, both trying different phrases, trying not to use obscure language, trying not to use acronyms, trying not to put too many mandatory requirements in, because obviously those can put people off. The open day events, some of which I've been to, people find it very encouraging to see other people who are serving on boards who look and sound and are more like them than their preconceptions about what type of people work on public boards. So there are a lot of different techniques that we have been trying to use to try and encourage the whole of the population to contribute to this.
I think that's laudable in terms of the outreach programmes, but also I think perhaps looking inside the process. What will you be doing to tackle that inherent unconscious bias that would be in the process and the system, and improving the figure 3 graph that we have in front of us, and to make sure that we are not seeing, I think, just repeated recycled candidates, and that we are seeing some new talent come through?
Well, obviously we can measure lots of new people coming in, and that's fresh talent is what we're trying to bring, as well as making use of people who are near misses, so to speak. I think in the training of people on those panels, being conscious themselves of when bias can apply, having a panel which does have an independent member can assist with that process. Even the way in which, as you rightly say, you write up the descriptions, and trying to make sure that you're trying to do that in a neutral, objective fashion. Certainly again, appointments where I've been involved in, that's one of the things you look at and try and say, does this give somebody who wasn't at the meeting themselves a fair impression of how the candidate came across, and have you drawn on all the available information to try and do that? So those are the types of things.
Thank you. And lastly, how will you measure the success of this outreach programme, and when will you be able to share with us the data in that level of success?
So I think that we are continuing to measure, if you like, data against gender and ethnicity and things like that. Our measures are less good for social background in terms of the overall data that we have, and we also don't have all that kind of different profession. Well, we haven't tended to analyse by professional background either. We have good data on geography.
Yes.
And I know that some parts of the country we feel are underrepresented, and you can see the reason we've been going to Darlington, Exeter, Edinburgh, London, Glasgow, Sheffield, Belfast. Tells you where we see there are opportunities where we should be getting more people from those places.
This is something which I was actually discussing with Baroness Neville Rolfe on Friday, because we were in Sheffield together at the outreach programme there at the Cutlers Hall in Sheffield, where we had something like 300 attendees from South Yorkshire. But it's a big cost to government to host an event like that, and to have a significant number of people from government attending. So we do need to be sure that we're doing the right thing and that it is actually working. We will be able to. We have got the names of all the people who attended. We will be able to see whether they sign up on the Cabinet Office Public Appointments website. We will be able to see whether they apply. And we also need to be better. Obviously, we'll also be able to see whether there's any improvement over time in regional diversity. But I do think it's important that we do measure those things and hold ourselves to account as to is this actually working.
Yeah.
And in terms of measuring the impact of outreach and how effective those events have been, we are surveying attendees of those events, and as things stand, including the event from Sheffield, so from Darlington to Sheffield, so all of the events we've held so far, 84% of those who attended strongly agree that they would recommend interest or involvement in the public appointments process to their colleagues or friends.
There we go. And often I say to school children in Hackney, don't let people do things about you without you. So it sounds like we've got some progress to be made there in government departments and other appointments. But thank you, Ms. Owen. Mr. Grant.
Thank you, Chair. Coming back to the appointments advisory panels, and obviously if you've got a panel of 4 or 5 people, it can't be represent the full diversity of the United Kingdom. If you look at every one of those panels that sat in the last 2 or 3 years, where you've got hundreds of people that sat on those panels, do you monitor and publish a breakdown at that level by gender, by ethnicity, by other things, so that people can at least see that, right? Why don't you do that? Because that would give us a very quick temperature check to say, over the piece, these panels, each one individually doesn't look too bad. Over the piece, there's far too many old white men like me on the panel.
I think it's certainly something that we could go away and look at. I think that primarily it's probably because Cabinet Office, the Centre, doesn't monitor the composition of the advisory assessment panels. They're dealt with within each department. But there may be ways in which we could monitor that more effectively that we could take away and look at.
Thank you. And finally from me, when you're looking at the job description and in particular the person specification, if, for example, there's a requirement that you have to have a university degree, which a number of positions will ask for, that makes it harder for some ethnic groups in particular to apply, because we know there's significant differences in ethnic communities about who goes to university and who doesn't. People can be just as capable, but they demonstrate that in ways other than the letters after their name. Does anybody look at the person spec before it's published to flag up anything that's in there that is going to discriminate either for or against particular groups, so that at the very least somebody will be able to say, yeah, we realise that causes a problem, but for this particular post it absolutely needs to be somebody with a degree in whatever it is. It has to be somebody who's got a professional qualification. Do you go into in that level of detail for every appointment?
Yes, we'd expect that will be looked at before it goes to ministers.
Sorry, when you've said it a number of times, Mr. Madden, we would expect it. Does that mean it happens, that you would like it to happen, but does anyone monitor to see if it's happening, and what happens if you find it's not?
So, as I say, the Cabinet Office doesn't micromanage each individual appointment, but it would be good practice for that role description to be checked thoroughly, that it's appropriate before it goes to ministers.
And in our training and guidance, why don't some of these excellent points made by the committee here, we should make sure that's factored in. So
Does anyone ever go back and report, again, not necessarily identifying individual posts, to pull together all of the appointments during a year and to say this number of appointments we don't think complied with best practice in some way? Or again, is it just left to individual ministers who probably won't be there next year by the time the annual report, and not just this year but any year, because there can be an issue that ministerial turnover can be so fast that if there's bad practice by a minister in a particular department, the chances are they're moved on by the time the annual report comes up.
That is not currently something that we track and report on, but it might be worth mentioning, if I may, the really successful boardroom apprenticeship scheme. Yes. Which we support. It's a DLUC initiative, but initially came over from Northern Ireland, and this is it's a non-executive director boardroom programme, which
yeah, we're aware of.
You're aware of the
are you
program.
monitoring the diversity of the people who are board apprentices?
So DLUC does monitor that diversity, and it I think it has
across all the diversities that we've been discussing.
I think so. Yes, I can write to you.
If you could write to us on that, because that is sometimes a way of
Yes.
we've seen it in practice elsewhere.
And we always invite a member of the boardroom apprenticeship programme to come along to our outreach session so that they can talk and promote about the benefits of that scheme.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Grant. Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown, Deputy Chair.
Mr. Madden, I'll ask you this question. When Ms. Owen was asking her excellent questions on diversity, it did occur to me that in job interviews, unsuccessful applicants do ask for feedback. Is there any sort of feedback ever given, either maybe by the chair of the Appointments Commission or anybody else? Can applicants ask for feedback?
So, yes, applicants can ask for feedback, but I think that as we look to improve the candidate experience as part of our work, I think that we should look to take a more proactive approach to providing that feedback. So not only to benefit for the individuals for that particular appointment, but also so they're not disincentivised to leave the public appointments sort of interest system, if you like. They should want to stay close in case they want to apply for other roles. So that should be a routine part, I think, of ongoing candidate care.
Yeah, that was precisely the purpose of the question, in case they want to apply for other roles.
Yes, so that's what we would look to ensure becomes a more routine practice.
Very helpful, thank you. Slightly critical question, Sir Annex. Can I take you to paragraph 3.9? And you would expect me to. I'm sure you were waiting for this question. And as of in that paragraph, it says, as of November 2023, 261 roles had been advertised on the system. 27 campaigns had been completed, 18 people had been appointed, and complete time data were only available for 2 appointments. For comparison, the Commissioner reported 624 appointments in 22-23. And then this is the critical bit. Our review of the data confirmed that some data were being entered after the fact. Basic errors in data entry, such as inverting dates, also means that the data generated are not accurate. And it goes on to say, until more departments are using the system as intended, Cabinet Office will not be able to maximise the usefulness of the new system. What are you doing to put that right?
We agree that's not satisfactory, and we've written to all the users of the scheme, all departments and all public bodies, to remind them about how to use it correctly, giving this feedback, and have also organised a series of training events and strengthened our guidance on this point. I share your disappointment.
When would you expect that all, I mean, so basic, entering data correctly.
Yeah.
It's almost dishonest to enter data after the fact. When would you expect all departments to comply with proper procedures?
Being a tiny bit charitable to colleagues, it is a new system. It was introduced in April. It hasn't yet had a first full year of running. I think this whole process, this NAO report, this PAC hearing, we might write again in reinforcement of some of the points arising, will get people used to using a new system. And with the use of that system, correct use of that system, that is obviously an absolute game changer, as it has correctly been described in terms of our quality of the overall system, which is already good, but will be much enhanced in that way.
Thank you very much. And I mean, in terms of timeliness of data,
yeah.
We haven't talked today at all about professional recruiters, recruitment agencies.
Yep.
It does seem to me that they are fairly lax at providing real-time data. What can you do to improve that?
Our system will produce real-time data, which is great. The only limitation there is when you do use external research companies, we don't give them access to our system, because that would obviously, there would be data protection and other issues involved there, and commercial advantage potentially from doing so. So, that's a limit.
So I understand that, absolutely, but if you're not giving them access to the system, which I understand why you're not, how are you going to make sure that your system is as up to date as it needs to be on the bits of the recruitment that they are doing?
We're working, thank you, we're working with the executive search agencies or recruitment consultants to to find ways in which they can we can integrate the data reporting that they would have, so that then that is fully reflected in the ATS. So whether that's done centrally or with departments, but we're currently working that through with them.
Thank you very much.
And can I ask you, Sir Alex, this excellent new tracking system that seems as though it's going to produce great results, or already is producing results. When will you decide, or maybe you have decided, I don't know, what information you'll be giving to ministers, and particularly what information you'll be giving to Parliament, so that we can have greater transparency in the whole system?
As you're familiar, the decisions about exactly what is published are taken by ministers. But you're fully aware now of the potentiality of the new system, and obviously Parliament is powerful and effective in asking for information it wishes to see.
We're able to make recommendations.
As night follows day, how long is that likely to take?
Well, we'll have just completed our first full year of running. As you've seen from this interim report from the NAO, it's not yet working perfectly, but it is working extremely well and will provide rich data. Also, there are some enhancements to the system which we're going to be introducing so that it is a workflow-based system, so that it prompts universally things that you should be doing. For example, making sure that you have, if you're a candidate applying, that you've declared your conflicts of interest. If you're a person, monitoring that system.
Alex, that was an excellent answer, but it didn't answer my question.
Yeah.
When do you expect this to take place?
For us,
Will the decision be made? I'm not asking what the decision is. When do you expect the decision to be made?
Mr. Madden?
I would say that certainly later this calendar year we expect to be in a position to outline a plan to ministers on how the data should be used. But the more confident we are in the maturity of the system and the quality of the data, the quicker we can look at ways in which we can share that.
Presumably you're sharing it with the Commissioner for Public Appointments.
So the Commissioner could have access to that. I mean, departments, it's fair to say that departments have a dashboard already, so they can use
the Commissioner
that.
Doesn't yet have a dashboard.
So I believe that he does have access to that information. And departments certainly have access to that information so that they can identify process improvements themselves. So they have a dashboard that they have access to. And ministers are currently given each fortnight a forward look of all the appointments that are coming down the pipeline. So we're already starting to use the data, but I hope it won't be too long before we can actually use it to improve transparency and drive accountability.
We have a suite of recommendations that will come out of this, so we can think about how we do that. I just had some final quick questions. First of all, on political activity and political donations. There are examples which I can't, for obvious reasons, outline in detail, where, not being politically active shouldn't preclude people from ever holding a public position, clearly, because some people have expertise but also political persuasion, and I think the figures Alex highlighted for 3% of all appointments, and you gave the figures by breakdown, but there have been examples where people have had political activity or political donations which would make it inappropriate for them to hold a position, but the board's expertise and knowledge of political activity is not deep enough to understand what that means. Let me put for an example. I think for example, it come May the 2nd, when we got local elections, if someone declared that they were busy actively knocking on doors at that point, they're probably pretty politically active, for example. But a board of people who are not politicians might not appreciate that, or might not appreciate that leaflets published even a decade ago might still be in existence, that kind of thing. So how do you make sure that your boards are properly aware when they're recruiting? And you say you don't follow every case, Mr. Madden, but how do you set in the guidance some sort of guidance about whether something is significant enough to be considered?
Well, certainly in our review of guidance, that's one of the issues that we want to try to address, so that bodies themselves and departments and permanent secretaries are aware of, are better aware of those issues and how to best handle them.
Okay. It is a challenge if someone's not political, but that's when ministers actually probably know better, and for good or ill. Okay, well, I'll leave that one there for now, because I think there certainly can be issues there which are difficult to go into in public. And then the use of headhunters and transparency. So Jeffrey touched on this a bit, but I mean, headhunters again will do their work obviously at the behest of the department, but not always. They don't always know as well as they should do what's actually required. And I have again come across experience where a headhunter has been unwilling to give honest feedback to a candidate because the candidates are obviously future cash cows for headhunters. So they want to be nice to the people who didn't make it through. So how do you make sure that you're really getting the best value out of headhunters, but also the best practice out of headhunters, so that they are nurturing future candidates for public office, but who might actually apply direct?
I mean, I think it's a really important point that people do get really good quality feedback. And I think good practice there is at the end of the panel discussion to conclude what feedback should be given to whom and by whom and in what way. And that's certainly what I have practiced. And that's true even if you have a search firm. So if they're going to do it, to say, this is, you need to speak to that person in this way and let me know when you've done that.
Okay, so, well, I suppose there's no need so far. We can take that with a generalised example.
Yeah.
And then just, you talked a couple of times about CVs, and particularly in response to Ms Owen's comments, Mr Madden, about people putting CVs up on the system. But it's well recorded. I think it was the Runnymede Trust that did some work on this many years ago about how CVs are not as fair in terms of diversity as an application form. Have you considered, are any of the jobs requiring application forms? Are they all CVs, and how do you make the judgment?
So CVs are only part of the application. So candidates are also required to present a covering statement, which shows how they personally meet the role.
But my point is, these are personalised documents. If you and I wrote a CV down, we would put different things in it, even if it was you could put 3 versions of the same accurate, honest position. But that means that people are presenting themselves in a particular way. It's well known that for diversity reasons, if you have an application form where everyone's having to answer the same criteria, and sometimes blind applications, though possibly for some of the very specific roles in this sector, that might not always be appropriate. How do you understand that? So have you considered an application form approach to help increase diversity?
It's not something that we've considered to date, but certainly something that maybe we can take away. To look at in the context of diversity.
Mr Passey and Mr Jary from other roles.
What you describe is increasingly common in the corporate sector. You're absolutely right, and indeed the use of blind applications, particularly at the initial stages of a process.
So how far have you seen initial blind go up? Because they're quite senior jobs, some of these, so it might be easy to identify somebody for potentially, but how far do they go blind in the corporate sector currently, in your experience?
In my firm, just to take one example, we not only do blind screening, we actually do blind interviews. So the interviewer does not have the CV of the candidate either in advance of or at the interview.
Oh, that's quite. Is that challenging for the interviewer?
No, because it means that they recruit on criteria which are relevant to the job, rather than what's on the paper in front of them.
Wow. Is that common?
I think it's not. I wouldn't say it was common. I think it is increasingly being adopted, but it's probably still by a minority of companies.
But it would still be that someone in HR would be filtering through on the basis of the applications. So they will see that. So, yeah.
This is a big topic. At more junior levels, no, someone at HR would not see the CVs. What happens to not CVs. We don't have CVs. Yeah. We have application forms, as you say, and the application forms are then weighted against the database, which corrects for bias by region, social background, educational establishment, and so on, and is trying to measure outperformance rather than absolute performance.
Okay.
And that's a mechanism which some employers are now adopting, and there are a number of firms who are selling technology solutions which enable this to take place.
Okay. So it's interesting. Ms Passey, have you got anything to add?
At the very senior level in the corporate space, I've never seen an application form. I've never seen a search firm send out an application form. I have seen instances in more junior recruitment campaigns which would involve AI, for example, a screening through an AI process, and might involve an application form, but not at the most senior levels that I've been exposed to.
Okay, thank you. That's interesting. We could, as you say, Mr. Jary, an interesting topic. We could extend much further, but it's a bit beyond the remit of today's session. But can I thank our witnesses very much indeed for their time? I mean, people who do public appointments do a great service to the taxpayer and the citizen, and their vital roles. But we also want to make sure, as you've heard from our questioning, that they're fair, well managed, and represent the wide range of people available to do the important work. So can I thank you for your time? Order. I should just say the transcript will be available on the website.
The Grimmond Room. Portcullis House, 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 the Grimmond Room.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.